My name is Lena Haverson, and I'm 22 years old. 10 years ago, my parents sold my future so my sister could be the prodigy. They convinced everyone I had no ear for music, that the piano was hers alone. They buried my audition recordings, deleted every application I ever submitted, and erased me from the family story so thoroughly I started to believe I'd never had a gift at all. Then last Tuesday, a single voicemail from the Oberlin Conservatory admissions office asked why I'd never responded to the full scholarship acceptance letter they mailed 3 years ago. They destroyed my future, but they forgot that talent doesn't need permission. The Haverson family looked perfect from the outside: 4 pianos, 2 daughters, 1 prodigy. That's the story my parents sold. But behind closed doors, a second musician was practicing in the dark. For 10 years, I watched my sister Grace take every lesson, every recital, every ounce of their investment, while my mother was methodically deleting my audition tapes and my father was rehearsing the lie. Lena has no ear for music. Now a voicemail from Oberlin has cracked that fiction wide open. And what's coming next is a reckoning my parents never prepared for. Let me take you back to the beginning, to a 2-story colonial in Westbrook, Connecticut, where the first thing you saw when you walked through the front door was the grand piano. Not family photos, not a coat rack. A 9-foot Steinway Model D, polished black, lid always propped open like it was waiting for a concert that never ended. That piano cost more than my parents' first car. It was the altar of the Haverson household, and my sister Grace was its high priestess. Growing up, there were 2 daughters in the Haverson home, but only 1 musician. That was the official story, repeated at every dinner party, every holiday gathering, every parent-teacher conference. Grace has the gift. Lena, well, she tries. My parents, Edward and Caroline Haverson, were not musically talented themselves. My father sold commercial real estate and my mother managed his office. But they had ambitions. Specifically, they had ambitions that required a prodigy. Grace is 3 years older than me. She started piano at 4, and by 7, her teacher was using words like exceptional and once in a generation. My parents leaned in hard. Private lessons twice a week with a professor from Hart School. Summer intensives at Tanglewood. Competitions in Boston, New York, Philadelphia. Every ribbon, every trophy, every newspaper clipping went into a scrapbook my mother updated like it was a sacred text. Grace was the golden child, not just in the way siblings sometimes feel, but in the clinical, textbook sense. The child who could do no wrong because her success was the family's entire identity. I was the shadow. I started piano at 5 like Grace. But here's what no one outside the house knew: I was good, really good. My first teacher, Mrs. Delgado, told my mother privately that I had perfect pitch and an instinct for phrasing that couldn't be taught. She recommended me for the same conservatory prep program Grace had done. My mother smiled, nodded, and never mentioned it again. I didn't find out about that conversation until 20 years later. By then, it was too late. At 8 years old, I composed my first piece, a short prelude in C minor, simple but original. I played it for my parents after dinner one night, fingers shaking on the keys, heart pounding. My father looked up from his newspaper. "That's nice, sweetheart." Then he turned to Grace. "Play the Chopin again, the one from your recital." Grace played the Chopin. I walked upstairs and didn't compose another piece for 6 years. But I didn't stop playing. I couldn't. Music wasn't something I did, it was how I understood the world. When I was sad, when I was invisible, when Grace was accepting another trophy and my parents were applauding in the front row, I would wait until the house was empty and then I would play. Not Grace's repertoire, my own. Hours of improvisation, of pouring everything I couldn't say into the keys. It was the one place I felt real. By middle school, the pattern was set. Grace received every resource: the best teacher, the summer programs, the new sheet music, the recording equipment. I received the hand-me-down lesson books and the reminder that the piano needed to be free by 4 for Grace's practice. When I asked to audition for the regional youth orchestra, my mother said no. "We can't dilute the focus. It wouldn't be fair to Grace." Fair. That word sat in my chest like a stone. High school was worse. Grace was applying to conservatories: Juilliard, Curtis, Oberlin, Eastman. The house became a pressure cooker. My parents hired a consultant to manage her applications, a woman who charged $300 an hour to polish essays and select audition repertoire. Meanwhile, I quietly prepared my own audition materials. I recorded 3 pieces in the school music room during lunch periods, using borrowed equipment I'd learned to operate from YouTube tutorials. I filled out applications to 6 conservatories, including Oberlin, not because I expected to get in, but because I needed to know. I needed an answer from the world that wasn't my parents telling me to step aside. I mailed those applications myself, paid the fees with money from my part-time job at a bookstore, checked the mailbox every day for 6 months, waiting for letters that never came. When the rejection arrived from Oberlin, a thin, single-page letter I found in the kitchen trash, already opened, I stared at it for an hour. I'm sorry to inform you that we are unable to offer you admission. I'd failed, just like my parents always said I would. I told no one. I quit playing entirely for 2 years. But here's what I didn't know then. What I'm only beginning to understand now. The letter I found wasn't sent by Oberlin. It was printed on my mother's office laser printer, using a template she'd reconstructed from Grace's actual rejection letters. My mother, Caroline Haverson, PTA president, church choir volunteer, sat down at her desk one afternoon and fabricated a rejection notice to convince her own daughter she had no talent. And that wasn't even the worst of it. This is the part that still makes my hands shake. 3 years ago, Oberlin did send a letter. A thick envelope, the kind that means acceptance, full scholarship. The Arthur Dan Piano Scholarship, one of the most prestigious awards in the country. That envelope arrived on a Thursday morning. My mother was the one who retrieved the mail. She opened it, read it, and then she placed it in a manila folder along with my audition recording and my application materials, and she hid that folder in the attic behind boxes of Christmas decorations. She never told my father. She never told Grace. She certainly never told me. I was 18 years old, working double shifts at a coffee shop, believing I was a failed musician who'd been foolish to ever dream. And all the while, a full ride to one of the best conservatories in the world was rotting in my attic, 4 feet above my childhood bedroom. The voicemail that came last Tuesday was from an admissions coordinator named Miriam. She'd been cleaning out old files and found a note about an unclaimed scholarship from the class of 3 years ago. "We're just trying to reconcile our records," her voice said, casual, oblivious. "It appears you never responded to our acceptance letter. Is there a reason you declined the Dan scholarship?" I played that voicemail 47 times. I counted. Because when you've spent your entire life believing you're not enough, and then you learn that someone deliberately made sure you never got the proof, something in you breaks. But something else ignites. I drove to my parents' house that evening. I didn't call ahead. I walked straight past my father in the living room, up the pull-down stairs to the attic, and I found the folder exactly where I now suspected my mother had stored it. Inside, my original application, my audition recording on a CD labeled in my own handwriting, and the acceptance letter. "Congratulations," the first line read. "We are delighted to inform you." My mother's footsteps on the stairs behind me. "Lena, what are you doing up there?" Her voice had that careful calm she uses when she's trying to manage a crisis. I turned around, holding the letter in my hand, and I watched her face go pale in the attic light. She opened her mouth to speak, and that's when I knew I wasn't leaving until I had every single answer she'd been hiding for 10 years. My mother didn't scream. She didn't deny it. She just stood there, one hand braced against the attic beam, staring at the acceptance letter like it was evidence in a murder trial, which in a way it was. "Mom," I said, voice shaking. "Explain this now." She opened her mouth, closed it, then did the thing she's always done when cornered. She went calm, the same calm she used to soothe Grace before a recital. "Lena, sweetheart, it's not what you think." I held up the letter. "It's an acceptance letter from Oberlin. A full scholarship. That's exactly what I think it is." She took a step toward me, palms up. "You have to understand the context. Grace was applying that same year. If you'd gone to Conservatory too, it would have split our focus. You know how fragile Grace's confidence was back then. One wrong move, one comparison, and she could have crumbled." I stared at her. "So you made sure there was no comparison. You erased me. You printed a fake rejection letter and let me believe I had no talent. For 10 years. My mother's jaw tightened. I was protecting this family, and yes, I was protecting Grace. Someone had to. That's when I heard my father's footsteps on the attic stairs. He emerged, saw the folder, saw my face, and immediately looked at my mother. "Caroline, what's going on?" His voice had the edge of a man who's been managing other people's crises his entire career and now senses one he can't fix. My mother didn't answer. "I'll tell you what's going on," I said. 3 years ago, Oberlin accepted me with a full scholarship. Mom hid the letter. She faked a rejection. She let me quit music thinking I was a failure. My father went absolutely still. It took him 6 full seconds to process. Caroline, is that true? She turned away, and in that silence, I got my answer. He looked at her with an expression I'd never seen, not anger exactly, but the slow, horrified recognition of someone realizing they've been living next to a stranger. I knew you pushed hard for Grace, he said quietly. But this, you told me Lena didn't have the discipline. You said she didn't want it. She didn't want it, my mother said, turning back. Not the way Grace did. Lena was always more interior. She would have been crushed by the competition. I actually laughed. You don't get to decide what I could handle. You just didn't want me to prove you wrong. I pulled out my phone, hit record, and set it on a box of Christmas lights. Tell me everything, start to finish. My mother stared at the phone, then at me. You're recording this, every word. My father rubbed his face, then nodded. She has that right, Caroline. For the first time in my life, my father was siding against my mother. It was disorienting. My mother exhaled and began talking, her voice flat and clinical, like she was reading a deposition. She'd intercepted the Oberlin acceptance on a Thursday morning. She read it twice, then drove to her office, formatted a rejection letter using the same phrasing from a genuine Eastman rejection Grace had received 2 years prior, printed it on bond paper, and placed it in the kitchen trash where I'd find it. But that was only the final act. 2 months before that, she'd called the Oberlin admissions office, impersonating me, and respectfully declined my application before decisions were even finalized. The admissions coordinator noted the early withdrawal in my file. That's why I never received the official acceptance directly. The letter she hid was a delayed follow-up, sent after the scholarship committee wondered why I hadn't responded to earlier notifications. She had been managing this for months. And before that, she'd sabotaged my high school audition recordings by accidentally reformatting the hard drive where I stored them. She discouraged Mrs. Delgado from recommending me to programs. She deleted emails from summer music institutes. She'd built a wall around my talent so high I couldn't see over it, then convinced me the wall was mine. My father listened, face draining. He'd known about some things, the preference for Grace's schedule, the financial decisions that always prioritized her. He'd accepted my mother's narrative that Lena was sensitive and not as driven. But he never knew about the forged letter, the impersonation call, the systematic erasure. He sat down heavily on a trunk. My God, Caroline, my God. Stop the recording. I'm taking this folder, the letter, the CD, everything, and I'm going to contact Oberlin tomorrow. My mother's calm finally cracked. Lena, you can't. Think about Grace. She's about to debut at Carnegie Hall next month. Any scandal would destroy her. I looked at my mother, the woman who had spent my entire life convincing me I was ordinary while hiding proof of my brilliance in the attic. Maybe Grace should have thought about that before she built her career on my erasure. I didn't know then how deep Grace was actually involved. I'd find out within 48 hours, after a phone call that would make everything I just learned feel like the opening act. I drove home in a daze, clutching the folder. My apartment is small, a one-bedroom walk-up in New Haven, the kind of place you rent when you've spent years believing you don't deserve more. My keyboard stand stood in the corner, covered with a dust cloth I hadn't lifted in months. I sat on the floor, spread the contents of the folder around me, and called Miriam at Oberlin. It was after hours, but I left a voicemail. My name is Lena Haverson. I need to speak with someone about an unclaimed scholarship from 3 years ago. I think there's been a fraud. Then I called my Aunt Margaret, my mother's younger sister, the only relative who'd ever treated me like my music mattered. Aunt Margaret picked up on the second ring. I told her everything. She was silent for a long moment, then said, Lena, I tried to tell you. Years ago, your mother told me you'd given up music and asked me not to bring it up. She said it was too painful for you. I believed her. I closed my eyes. Another lie carefully planted. There's more, she said, voice tight. When you were 14, a professor from Hart called the house. He'd heard you play at a masterclass and wanted to take you on. Your mother told him you weren't pursuing music anymore. Then she called his department chair and accused him of overstepping. I hadn't known about the masterclass. I hadn't known about the phone call. Every time I thought I'd found the bottom, the floor dropped again. The next morning, I got a call from Grace. She was in London, rehearsing for a European tour. Her voice was rushed, distracted, the voice of someone who expects a conversation to be about logistics, not wreckage. Mom said you guys had a fight, something about old college stuff. I pulled the acceptance letter from the folder, photographed it, and texted it to her. Read this, I said. Silence on the line. Then, Lena, where did you get that? The attic, where Mom hid it 3 years ago. Where'd you think? More silence. I could hear her breathing, could almost hear the machinery in her mind recalibrating. Grace, did you know? She didn't answer immediately, and that pause was an answer all its own. Mom mentioned it last year, she finally said. She told me not to say anything. She said you'd moved on, that bringing it up would only hurt you. I don't know what I thought. My voice came out sharper than I intended. You thought protecting your own career was more important than telling me the truth. You let me believe I was a failure. At your last recital, when you dedicated the Chopin to the sister who never had the ear, you knew that was a lie. That's not fair, she whispered. You think it's fair that I spent 10 years hating myself because I wasn't you, because I trusted that my family wouldn't destroy me for the sake of a spotlight. She had no answer. I hung up. 2 hours later, Miriam from Oberlin returned my call. She'd pulled my file. Ms. Haverson, I need to be transparent with you. There's a note in your record from 3 years ago. It says you voluntarily withdrew your application prior to final committee review. The acceptance letter we sent afterward appears to have been generated in error. The system failed to cancel your scholarship award after the withdrawal was processed. I gripped the phone. That's not what happened. I never withdrew. My mother called, pretending to be me. I can prove it. Miriam was quiet. Ms. Haverson, if that's true, this is a serious matter. I need to escalate this to our Legal and Admissions Integrity Office. Are you prepared for an investigation? I thought about Grace's Carnegie Hall debut. I thought about my mother's carefully constructed facade. I thought about the 10 years I spent believing I was nothing. Yes, I said. I'm ready. What happened next moved faster than I expected. Oberlin's Integrity Office sent a formal inquiry to my parents' home address. My father called me that evening, voice ragged. Lena, they're asking questions. They're going to interview us. Your mother is, he trailed off. She's not well. She's not well, she's not the one whose life was stolen, he sighed. I know, but please, can we meet? Before this goes any further, just you and me. I agreed, because despite everything, I needed to understand why he didn't see it. How a father could live in the same house as all that deception and never ask the right question. We met at a diner off the interstate, the kind of place we'd never gone as a family, too ordinary, no piano in the corner. He was already there, nursing a coffee, looking like he'd aged a decade since the attic. He slid a manila envelope across the table. Before you make any decisions, you should know the full story. Inside was a stack of documents. My mother's notes, a timeline she'd written out years ago, and something I'd never seen before, a psychological evaluation of Grace from when she was 15. The report described a child with severe anxiety, performance-based self-esteem, and a fear so profound of not being special that her therapist warned she was at risk of collapse if she ever faced genuine competition. My father's voice was hoarse. Your mother was terrified. She believed Grace couldn't survive sharing the spotlight. She convinced herself that sacrificing you was the only way to save Grace. I pushed the envelope back. That's not an explanation, Dad. That's a pathology, and you let it happen. You never once checked. You never once asked me, Lena, how are you doing? Are you still playing? You just accepted whatever Mom told you because it was easier. He didn't deny it. The next revelation came in the form of an email from Oberlin. The investigation had uncovered additional communication, 3 emails from my mother's IP address, sent over a period of 11 months, all reinforcing the fraudulent withdrawal. One included a forged letter of recommendation from a teacher who had, in fact, praised my abilities. Another claimed I'd been diagnosed with a performance anxiety disorder that made conservatory study inadvisable. My mother had manufactured an entire medical narrative to justify my exit. When the investigators called Grace, she confirmed she'd heard Mom reference the anxiety issue, but had never verified it. She didn't want to know. And then came the pivot I never saw coming. Grace released a statement, publicly, on her professional website and social media. I have recently learned that my sister Lena Haverson was denied the opportunity to attend music conservatory due to deliberate interference within our family. I benefited from circumstances that, however unknowingly on my part, were built on an injustice. I am withdrawing from my upcoming performances to reflect and to support my family's reckoning with this truth. The internet erupted. Within hours, the story was picked up by classical music blogs, then the local news, then national outlets. the golden child who stepped off her pedestal. When Grace called me that night, her voice was raw. I don't know if that was the right thing. I just knew I couldn't walk onto that stage and pretend anymore. I didn't know what to say. For 10 years, she'd been the enemy in my head, but hearing her now, she sounded more like a fellow survivor of a system we'd both been trapped in. "Where are you?" I asked. "I'm at JFK. I flew back. Can I see you?" I looked at the keyboard in the corner, the dust cloth still on it. "Yes," I said. "Come over." She arrived an hour later, carrying a single overnight bag and a folder of her own. Inside was a letter from her therapist, dated 2 years earlier, recommending she reconcile with her sister but cautioning that the truth would be destabilizing for the family system. She'd never shown it to anyone. "I've known something was wrong since I was 19, she said, sitting on my worn couch. "Mom would make these comments. Lena's fine, she's happy, she's not like you." I stopped asking because it was easier not to know. That's my guilt to carry. I didn't absolve her, but I didn't rage at her either. We sat in the quiet of my apartment, two daughters of the same impossible expectations, and for the first time in our lives, we were actually on the same side. The doorbell rang at 10:30 that night. It was my father, and he was carrying a box I recognized, the scrapbook, the one my mother had filled with Grace's achievements. "I found this when your mother was packing," he said. "She's agreed to a psychiatric evaluation. I'm filing for separation." He opened the scrapbook to the last page, where a photo of Grace at her senior recital was taped beside a blank space. "I think this was supposed to be yours," he said. She left a space. There was never anything in it. He handed me the box. I took it. I didn't know what I'd do with it. Maybe burn it, maybe keep it as evidence. But as I looked at my father standing in my doorway, exhausted and hollowed out, I realized the investigation wasn't just about exposing what my mother had done. It was about everything that came after. The restitution, the rebuilding, and the question neither of us had answered yet. What do you do when the truth finally arrives, and you have to decide what you're going to build from the wreckage? Because Oberlin's next letter was already in my mailbox, and it contained an offer that none of us were ready for. The letter was from Oberlin's Dean of Admissions. It arrived via certified mail, not email, not a phone call, but a physical envelope with the Conservatory's embossed seal, the kind of paper that announces importance before you've read a single word. I opened it standing at my kitchen counter while Grace watched from the couch, still wearing her airplane clothes, eyes hollow with jet lag and guilt. The letter contained two things. First, a formal acknowledgement that my withdrawal had been fraudulent and that my application, had it been properly considered, would have resulted in admission with a Dan scholarship. Second, an invitation. The Conservatory was offering me a place in the incoming fall class, not a deferred admission, not a conditional acceptance. A seat, a scholarship, a chance to start, at 22, what should have begun at 18. I read the letter aloud. When I finished, Grace's face crumpled, not with jealousy, with relief. "Take it," she whispered. "Lena, take it." But it wasn't that simple. Because even as I stood there holding my second chance, the machinery my mother had built was still grinding forward, and the damage was spreading in directions none of us had anticipated. The first explosion came from the classical music press. A journalist at WQXR in New York had picked up Grace's public statement and started digging. Within 72 hours, she'd interviewed two of Grace's former teachers, a summer program administrator who remembered my anxiety disorder excuse, and Mrs. Delgado, my first piano teacher, now 73, who told the reporter through tears that she'd known I had the gift and had spent 20 years wondering what happened to me. The article ran under the headline, "The Prodigy, the Shadow, and the Mother Who Chose One." It went viral in classical music circles. Then it crossed over, a segment on NPR, a write-up in the Washington Post. Suddenly my family's dysfunction was being discussed in comment sections and on morning shows. My mother was labeled a stage mother from hell. My father was called willfully blind. Grace was the golden child who knew, and I was the silenced talent. I didn't choose those labels, but I couldn't escape them either. My mother's response was swift and surgical. She hired a crisis PR consultant, a woman named Vivian who specialized in family reputation management, which is apparently an actual profession for people with money and problems. Within days, a narrative began circulating through back channels. Caroline Haverson was a devoted mother who'd made difficult choices to protect a mentally fragile child. Lena had always been emotionally unstable. The anxiety disorder wasn't fabricated. It was a mother's intuitive diagnosis that the medical establishment had failed to formalize. The revisionism made me nauseous, but what made it worse was discovering that my mother had been preparing for this moment. The psychological evaluation of Grace I'd seen in my father's envelope was one of many documents. During a visit to my parents' house, my father let me in while my mother was at a lawyer's office. I found a locked file cabinet in the basement. My father, hollow-eyed and barely speaking, handed me the key. "She's had this for years," he said. I never looked inside. Inside, I found a dossier on me. A binder with tabs organized by year. Lena Behavioral Issues. Lena Music Teacher Communications. Lena College Plans. There were notes documenting every time I'd cried after being excluded from a recital, reframed as emotional dysregulation. There was a letter from a child psychologist my mother had consulted when I was 12, stating that without evaluating me directly, she couldn't diagnose anything, but my mother had written possible borderline tendencies in the margin in her own handwriting. There were printouts of emails between my mother and Grace's teachers, carefully omitting any mention of my abilities while emphasizing Grace's fragility. And then there was the recording, a CD labeled Lena Age 14 Audition Practice. I didn't remember being recorded. I brought it home, played it on the old boombox I used to practice with, and listened to myself at 14 playing Chopin's Ballade No. 1. It was raw and imperfect, but it was real. And at the end, I heard my mother's voice in the background, not knowing the recorder was on. "She's better than Grace was at this age. That's a problem." Those words, spoken to no one, recorded by accident, were the purest confession I'd ever hear. I sent the recording to the Oberlin investigator. I sent the dossier. I sent everything. The investigation, which had been moving at institutional pace, accelerated. The Admissions Integrity Office issued a preliminary finding. My withdrawal was fraudulent, my application had been tampered with, and Oberlin would be referring the matter to their legal counsel for potential action against Caroline Haverson. The word fraud in an official letter changes things. It's no longer family drama. It's a crime. My mother, through her attorney, issued a statement denying intentional fraud and claiming she'd acted in what she believed were the best interests of both daughters. She offered to make a donation to Oberlin's scholarship fund. She asked for a private resolution. She didn't reach out to me, not once. My father filed for separation the following week. Not divorce, he wasn't ready for that word, but legal separation, with me listed as a beneficiary on his life insurance for the first time since I'd left home. He came to my apartment to deliver the paperwork himself. "She's not the woman I married," he said, sitting at my small kitchen table, looking at the keyboard that was still covered in dust. Or maybe she always was, and I just didn't want to see it. He asked if he could hear me play. I sat down at the keyboard, lifted the dust cloth, and played the Chopin Ballade. Not perfectly, not yet, but when I finished, my father was crying. But the deepest revelation was still coming. And it arrived from an unexpected source, Grace's former therapist, the one who'd written the letter recommending reconciliation. She contacted me through a third party, carefully, professionally, with legal waivers in place. She couldn't violate confidentiality, but she could speak to patterns she'd observed over years of treating children from high-pressure musical households. What she told me reframed everything. The dynamic in my family wasn't just favoritism. It was what she called talent hoarding. A pattern where one child's gift is treated as a finite resource that must be protected by suppressing any competing talent in siblings. Sometimes it's a parent with unfulfilled ambitions. Sometimes it's a child so fragile that equality feels like annihilation. In our house, it was both. My mother needed Grace to be exceptional because Grace's exceptionalism justified my mother's life choices, leaving her own career, pouring everything into one child's promise. If I was also gifted, then what was all that sacrifice for? My talent didn't just threaten Grace. It threatened the story my mother had been telling herself for 20 years. The therapist explained something else. Children in Grace's position often know more than they admit, but their survival depends on not knowing too consciously. Grace's "I didn't know" was sincere and also a defense. She'd been carefully taught not to ask the questions that would have revealed the truth. She'd been rewarded for not noticing. That wasn't innocence, but it was also a kind of imprisonment. Armed with this understanding, Grace and I had our first real conversation. Not about logistics or damage control, not about what she knew or didn't know. We talked about what it was like to grow up in that house sitting on opposite ends of the same impossible bargain. Grace's version was, if I stop being exceptional, they'll stop loving me. My version was, no matter how exceptional I become, they'll never love me. Same wound, different symptoms. 1 week after the WQXR article, Grace announced she was postponing her European tour indefinitely and entering intensive therapy. Her management company released a statement citing personal and family health matters. The classical music community, which had initially rallied to my side, now began to fracture. Some saw Grace as a victim of the same mother who destroyed me. Others saw an opportunist protecting her brand. The comments sections grew teeth. Grace stopped reading them. Then came the worst moment. The moment I almost didn't include here because it still hurts in a way I don't have language for. My maternal grandmother, Nana Ruth, called me. She was 91, in assisted living, and confused about why her daughters weren't speaking. The assisted living staff had limited her internet access to protect her from disturbing content, which apparently included articles about her daughter committing fraud and her granddaughter being publicly vindicated. But someone had shown her a clipped version of the WQXR piece, and she called me in tears. Your mother says you're lying. She says you're jealous of Grace and trying to ruin the family. Her voice was small and bewildered. Lena, I don't know what to believe. I sat on the floor of my apartment, phone pressed to my ear, and tried to explain to my 91-year-old grandmother that her daughter had spent a decade erasing me. I don't know how much she understood. I only know that before we hung up, she said, I always loved hearing you play. And I realized my grandmother had never seen me perform, not once, because my mother never allowed it. The next morning, I made a decision. I called the Oberlin Dean's office and accepted the admission offer, not because I was ready, not because the timing was perfect, because I needed to reclaim something concrete from the wreckage. 4 years of music school, starting at 22 instead of 18. I'd be older than most of my classmates. I'd be rusty and self-conscious and probably in over my head, but I'd be there. And that was more than my mother had ever let me have. The acceptance triggered another round of media attention. A producer from a cable documentary series reached out. So did a literary agent interested in a memoir. I said no to almost all of it. I wasn't ready to be a symbol. I was barely ready to be a student. But the institution that had been stolen from me was now being restored. And standing at the edge of that new beginning, there was one last reckoning I couldn't avoid. My mother had requested a meeting. Through her lawyer, through my father, through channels designed to protect everyone from a direct confrontation that might end up in a courtroom. She wanted to talk in person. No lawyers, no recording devices, just the two of us at a neutral location to find closure. I had no idea if I'd say yes. I had no idea if closure was even possible. But I knew this. Whatever happened in that room, it would either be the end of the story or the beginning of a new one. And I was no longer the girl who needed permission to decide which it would be. My answer was coming, and so was she. I said yes to the meeting, not because I wanted closure. I wasn't sure that word even applied to the woman who'd built a decade-long campaign to erase me. I said yes because I needed to look her in the eyes one last time as the person she couldn't destroy. If she wanted a reckoning, she was going to get one on my terms. We met at a public library in Hartford. Neutral ground, her lawyer's suggestion. No recording devices, her condition. I agreed to the first and ignored the second. My phone was in my pocket, recording, not for a court case, but for my own protection. I'd learned that Caroline Haverson's version of reality couldn't be trusted without a permanent record. She arrived 5 minutes late, dressed in a navy blazer and pearls, the same outfit she'd worn to every parent-teacher conference where she'd told my teachers I just wasn't as gifted as Grace. She sat across from me at a study table and folded her hands like we were negotiating a contract. Thank you for coming, she began. Her voice was measured, the one she used for school fundraisers and difficult client calls. I want you to know that everything I did out of love. I let that sit. Outside the window, a bus wheezed past. Love, I said. You forged a rejection letter, impersonated me on the phone, deleted my recordings, fabricated a medical diagnosis, and hid evidence of my talent for 10 years. Is that your definition of love? She flinched but recovered. You have to understand the context. Your father and I built our entire lives around Grace's future. If you had succeeded too, it would have destabilized everything. Grace would have crumbled. The family would have fractured. I was making a terrible choice between two terrible outcomes. I leaned forward. You didn't choose between two terrible outcomes. You chose Grace. You always chose Grace. And you didn't just choose her, you made sure I believed there was no choice to make. That's not sacrifice, that's erasure. She opened her mouth, then closed it. For a moment, something raw flickered behind her eyes, not remorse exactly, but recognition. I know you're angry, she said carefully. I know I hurt you, but I'm asking you not to pursue the legal case. Oberlin is willing to settle. We can put this behind us. You can go to school, become the musician you always wanted to be, and we can move forward. As a family. I pulled out a printout of her PR consultant's proposed narrative, the one that painted me as emotionally unstable and her as a devoted mother. I slid it across the table. Is this what moving forward looks like? She stared at the paper, her mouth tightened. That was a mistake. I've already terminated Vivian's contract. You hired her, I said. You fed her those lies. You don't get to call it a mistake just because it failed. Her voice sharpened. What do you want from me, Lena? Do you want me on my knees? Do you want me to burn everything down? I shook my head slowly. I don't want you on your knees. I wanted a mother who believed in me. I can't have that, so what I want now is accountability, the truth in writing. A full admission to Oberlin, to the family, to anyone you lied to. No hedging, no context, no protecting your reputation. And I want you to get professional help. Real help, not crisis management, not PR spin. She stared at me, the silence stretched. What if I can't do that? Then you'll never see me play a single note for the rest of your life. And if I ever have children, you won't hear their first piece either. You don't get to erase me and then ask for access on your terms. She cried, actual tears, not the performance kind. But I'd seen her cry before, at Grace's Juilliard audition results at the teary made-for-TV movie ending she loved. I couldn't tell anymore what was real and what was strategy, and that not knowing was the deepest damage she'd done. So I didn't comfort her, I stood up. Send me the admission, in writing, within 2 weeks, and then we'll see what's possible. I walked out of the library into pale February sunlight, and for the first time, I didn't look back over my shoulder to check her expression. 2 days later, the admission arrived. Not an email, a handwritten letter, 4 pages on her personal stationery. Absent were the phrases about context and love and terrible choices. Instead, she wrote, I sabotaged your musical career deliberately and systematically over a period of 10 years. I did this because I believed Grace was fragile and that your success would threaten her self-image. I prioritized my own desire for one exceptional daughter over my obligation to care for both of you equally. I lied to you, to your teachers, to Oberlin, and to everyone who asked. There is no excuse for what I did. I read it 3 times. Then I put it in the same drawer where I kept my Oberlin acceptance letter and my mother's forged rejection. But accountability has a way of spreading. The Oberlin investigation concluded with a formal recommendation to the Connecticut Attorney General's office for potential criminal fraud charges. The AG ultimately declined to prosecute. The case was messy, partly because I didn't want to testify against my mother in open court, partly because the passage of time made some of the evidence difficult to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. But the finding itself became public record. My mother's reputation in the music education community, already fissured, collapsed. The Hart School quietly rescinded a long-standing invitation for her to speak at a parents' symposium. The summer program, where she'd managed Grace's applications, sent a letter stating she was no longer welcome to volunteer. My mother, the PTA president, the choir volunteer, the woman who'd built her entire social identity around being a musical matriarch, was reduced to a cautionary tale whispered in the wings of recital halls. Grace spent the summer in intensive outpatient therapy. She pulled out of her Carnegie Hall debut and didn't perform publicly for nearly 8 months. When she finally returned, it was at a small benefit concert in New Haven, a modest program, a handful of Chopin nocturnes, no press, no fanfare. She invited me. I sat in the back row with my father, who held my hand during the entire performance. Neither of us said anything. Afterward, Grace found us in the lobby. It wasn't my best, she said, eyes anxious. It never had to be your best, I said. It just had to be yours. She hugged me. It was the first real hug we'd exchanged in 20 years. My father moved out of the family home, filed for divorce, and started seeing a therapist who specialized in family systems trauma. He began sending me recordings, not of Grace, but of me. He'd found them buried in a box in the garage, practice sessions from when I was 12 and 13, recorded on cassette tapes he'd kept without telling anyone. I didn't want to forget, he said, handing them over at a diner meeting. I told myself I was just saving memories. But I didn't intervene. I didn't ask questions. That makes me complicit. I need you to know I know that. I accepted the tapes. I didn't forgive him yet, but I let him into my apartment and made him coffee, and that was a start. I started at Oberlin in September. 22 years old, in a class full of fresh-faced 18-year-olds who'd been practicing scales while I'd been pulling espresso shots. It was humbling. My technique had atrophied. My sight reading was slow. My confidence, after years of being told I had no gift, was a shattered thing I had to reassemble measure by measure. My first jury, the semester-end performance evaluation, I played a Beethoven sonata that I'd practiced until my fingers cramped. I made 2 mistakes. The faculty sat impassively. When I finished, my primary teacher, Dr. Kapoor, said quietly, "You have a voice, Ms. Haverson. Now we just need to teach you how to trust it." The final surprising detail came 3 months after I arrived at Oberlin. I was organizing my dorm room when I found a sealed envelope my father had slipped into a stack of sheet music he'd given me as a moving-away gift. Inside was a letter from the Curtis Institute of Music, dated 6 years ago, addressed to me. It was an acceptance notification for their Summer Young Artist program, the same program that had launched Grace's professional trajectory. Below the acceptance was a handwritten note in my mother's script. Lena declined, family conflict. My father had underlined those words in red ink and written beside them, "I found this in her desk the night she moved out. I'm sorry I didn't show you sooner. I was afraid of what else I'd find." I called him, "Dad, the Curtis letter. How long have you known?" His voice cracked. "I found it 2 years ago. I confronted your mother. She said it was a misunderstanding, that you'd been too anxious to attend, that the program was too intense. I let myself believe her. It was easier." There was a long pause. "I'm done with easier, Lena. I'm so sorry." I sat in my dorm room, holding the letter from 6 years ago, and realized the full scale of what had been stolen from me. Not just one acceptance, not just one scholarship, a web of opportunities systematically dismantled by the person I'd been taught to trust most. That night, I went to a practice room and sat at the piano. I didn't play the Beethoven. I played my prelude in C minor, the one I'd written at 8 years old and never finished because my mother had dismissed it. I'd rewritten it from memory during my first semester, extending it, deepening it. It was still simple, but it was mine. And as I played the final chord, I thought about what I'd say at my first real recital the following spring, when I would perform that piece publicly for the first time. It wouldn't be about revenge. It would be about reclamation, a declaration that my mother had never won, even when she'd made me believe she had. The spring recital came on a Friday evening in April, in Warner Concert Hall, the acoustics so alive you could hear intentions as clearly as notes. I wore a simple black dress, no jewelry, no pretense. My father was in the 3rd row, Aunt Margaret beside him. My grandmother Nana Ruth, bundled in a wheelchair, frail but alert, sat at the end of the aisle. Grace flew in from London without telling anyone until she was already in the hall. Mrs. Delgado, my first teacher, now 74, sat near the back with tears already in her eyes. My mother was not there. I hadn't invited her. I played the Chopin Ballade No. 1, the piece I'd used in my illegal audition recording at 14, the piece my mother had filed away in her dossier labeled Problem. And then I played my own prelude, the one I'd resurrected from the ruins. When I finished, the silence that hung in the hall was the kind that means something. Then applause. Standing applause from my father, from Aunt Margaret, from Grace, who was weeping openly. Mrs. Delgado caught my eye and nodded once, a nod that carried 20 years of believing in a girl she'd never stopped hopping for. Afterward, my father found me in the green room. He was holding a small wrapped box. "This was your mother's," he said. "I found it when I was cleaning out the house before the sale. I wasn't sure if I should give it to you." I opened it. Inside was a single cassette tape labeled in my mother's handwriting, "Lena, 8 years old, first composition." I stared at it. She'd recorded me playing my first prelude. She'd kept it, hidden among her things, for 14 years. Why? Sentiment, guilt, evidence. I would never know. I handed it back to him. "Keep it safe," I said. "I'm not ready." He nodded. That night, Grace and I took Nana Ruth to dinner at a quiet restaurant near campus. At 92, our grandmother ate slowly and talked little, but at one point she reached across the table and took my hand. "I always loved hearing you play," she said, the same words she'd spoken over the phone months earlier. Now she was saying them while looking at me. I squeezed her hand. "Thank you for being here," she smiled, small and weary. "I should have been there sooner." It wasn't an apology exactly. But it was acknowledgement, and acknowledgement, I was learning, was its own form of repair. The Oberlin investigation had concluded, the news cycle had moved on, and the family I'd been born into was now scattered into new configurations. Grace in London, in therapy, rebuilding a career on her own terms. My father in a one-bedroom apartment, learning to cook, attending every recital I'd allow. My mother in the house she'd once filled with recital programs, now alone except for the dust gathering on Grace's old trophies. And me, in Ohio, at a conservatory that had held a seat for me across 5 years of silence. I'm not getting back what I lost. The teenage recitals I never played, the summer programs I never attended, the teachers I never had, the version of myself who might have walked into Oberlin at 18 with confidence instead of at 22 with scar tissue. That girl is gone, and I've stopped trying to resurrect her. But I'm building something new from the wreckage, a musician who knows exactly how much it costs to lose her voice and who will never again let anyone take it. That, in the end, is a different kind of strength, harder earned. I think about my mother's handwritten note on that Curtis acceptance. Lena declined, family conflict. 4 words that compressed a decade of sabotage into something that looked like my choice. That's the trick of erasure, it's rarely loud. It sounds like a concerned parent making a phone call. It looks like a rejection letter in the kitchen trash. It hides in calendars cleared for one child's lessons and empty for another's. The most dangerous lies aren't shouted. They're laminated into the ordinary routines of a household until even the person being erased starts to believe she chose her own disappearance. What saved me wasn't resilience. I wasn't stronger than anyone else who's been systematically diminished. I was lucky. A voicemail from an admissions coordinator who was just cleaning out old files. A scholarship that wouldn't stay quiet. A box in an attic that my mother forgot to destroy. If Miriam hadn't made that call, I'd still be pulling espresso shots, still believing I'd failed at the only thing I'd ever loved. How many other Lenas are out there, never reached by the random grace of a bureaucratic cleanup? How many silenced musicians, artists, scientists, whose families convinced them they were ordinary while hiding proof of their brilliance? Here's what I've learned, and I'm still learning it. Talent doesn't require an audience to exist, but it needs validation to survive. Not the shallow kind, not trophies or applause, but the deep structural validation that says you deserve resources, you deserve teachers, you deserve a chance. When someone systematically withholds that validation, they're not just hurting your feelings. They're foreclosing your future. And the people who do this often look like devoted parents. They show up at the right meetings, they use the right language, they cry at the right moments. You can live your whole life inside their architecture and never see the walls. My sister Grace is not my enemy. That took me years to understand, and I'm still understanding it. She was a child, too, groomed to believe her worth depended on being the only one. That's a different cage, but it's still a cage. She's out of it now, or trying to be. So am I. We're learning to be sisters in the rubble of a system neither of us built, but both of us survived. That's not a fairy tale reconciliation. It's awkward and slow and full of conversations that trail off into silence. But it's real, and real is more than this family has had for a very long time. If you're watching this and you see yourself in any part of the story, the overlooked child, the golden child forced to carry everyone's expectations, the parent who didn't ask the right questions, I want you to sit with the discomfort. Don't rush past it. The pattern doesn't break itself. It breaks when someone refuses to keep the secret, when someone opens the attic door, when someone says, "I'm not playing my assigned role anymore." That person might need to be you. If this story resonated with you, if it stirred something about your own family or your own voice or the talent someone told you you didn't have, leave a comment. I read them. Tell me, what would you have done? Would you have confronted your mother that night in the attic? Would you have accepted Oberlin's offer at 22? Would you have let Grace back into your life? And if you want more stories like this, stories about families and secrets and the long, uneven work of becoming yourself, check the description for one I think you'll need. Thank you for being here. I'll see you next time.